So again, this is a session on leveraging Esser funds and focusing particularly on the impacts. Esser is a federal grant which is anchored on the preparing, preventing, and responding to the results or impacts occurring due to COVID. Next slide. In this session, we're going to talk about the background. So where we were, where we are now. So what is our perspective lens now, and how we promote sharing out the use of these funds. We're going to talk about compliance and the cliff, the worrying about what happens when these fundings disappear. We're going to talk about how to produce documents or information that the public can use, our stakeholders can use, and focusing there on the style and structure and the content of what that information looks like. We'll talk also about the target audience and the goal as to why we're informing the public and our stakeholders more about the use of these funds. And lastly, we'll talk about the system of support that the Office of Public Instruction provides to all of you with this balance of advocacy and helping as auditors. Next slide, please. So where have we been? What is our background? Next slide. So when we look at the allocation of funding, and this is a high-level view from across the state, we look at Montana being allocated $605 million, and that was awarded in 3 different primary pockets, Esser 1, 2, and 3, and then a non-public component of EANS. On the right-hand side, you will see sort of a diagram of individual states, and those that are lighter colored received slightly less than 1 billion. Those that are the medium colors received between 1 and 9 billion, and then those in the darker colors above 10 billion. So as that money was allocated, it was allocated out based on an emergency need in the educational platform, and it was based on Title I proportionate funding. Next slide. So to use those funds, as we were allocated it, we had to think about where that money was coming from. So it's coming from the federal government and had requirements, and whether or not the different titles had different requirements. So Esser does have CARES, CARISA, and ARP, or Esser 1, 2, and 3. And while they are very similar in many ways, they are also separate. And the reporting back to the federal government, if those of you who are around who went through the data collection in the spring, remember there were different pockets or different things that were asked related to CARES 1 or CARISA 2. And so we need to keep our data separate because the grants, even though they anchor on the same name of Esser, they are in fact slightly different grants. And then in addition to that, we have some extra or smaller grants like the after school, the summer enrichment, homeless, and GEARS, and others. So it's important when we start looking at this grant and thinking about it to think both globally, Esser funds in general, but also what are the particular buckets or pockets that these fundings came out of. Department of Ed did allocate these funds to school districts through the state, and they used a Title I formula. So basically it was taking a look at what formula already existed within federal grants to apply to this new grant. And states did not ask for the funds from the standpoint of, we have this particular need, we want to do broadband, we want to improve our infrastructure, we want to run additional programs. It was the federal government saying, here's this money, you now can use it, and they allocated those funds on a state basis through the number of Title I students, and then the states, Montana, awarded it to districts based on that same formula. At that point, you are asked as an entity to come up with a plan to say, all right, now we have this money, how are we going to spend it? So right there, you can see the difference in between a traditional grant where you're first identifying what your needs are, money's attached to those needs, and then you apply, whereas this grant did the reverse. So now you have additional grant requirements that are coming from the Department of Education, and they are saying those plans need to exist. Data collection will occur. We're going to anchor on the 40% free and reduced lunch as a major impacted group. And we're going to require you to spend it within a certain time frame, track it, so report back out. And then also you're going to repeat that cycle for each one of the 3, ESSER 1, 2, and 3. So if you're not already holding up that sign of help, that's often where we see districts at this point. It is confusing. Next slide. So one of the things that I find very impactful is, I don't know how many of you have watched the Apollo 13. It's an old video, it's an old movie, but there's a part that talks about a square peg in a round hole. And one of the things that's said is, I suggest you invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole in response to, that's a contingency we hadn't planned on. Esser and COVID were not something that we planned on. And I think it's important to recognize that as we work with students, as we work with parents, as we work with teachers. All of us need to remember that it is an emergency situation and we are still responding to that emergency. As the funds were given to us, they were given to us in a grant format to assess needs, to go out into our districts and to say, what is it that we need? Recognizing that those needs in an emergency situation will change. So you get this huge flexibility to change within the grant. But there also are strings attached. There are guidelines that we have to follow in the use of those funds. And transparency is a major requirement of this grant. It is required that we report out to the public many times a year and in many different formats, including the plans, to how those funds were spent. Next slide. So again, encourage you to look at this snippet. You can just get it on YouTube to look at what did they use to solve the problem. And I think this visual is so impactful because basically these very high-level scientists, obviously very intelligent, knew what their situation was, and they had all kinds of pieces that they had to put together into a system to save lives. And you know, the bottom line is, with all of us working with students, we are in fact helping students save lives. And I don't say that lightly. I think we are out there in an education platform helping our students become the best citizens they can be. And often what we have to work with is what's thrown on this table. Money is a great thing to have, but using it impactfully is important. So again, I don't want to say this too much, but I think it's important to remember we're in an incredible position in the state of Montana to help these students, and these funds are really impactful. Next slide. So some of the tools that you can use in your background of how to use the funds, because it is kind of this mesh, is the Department of Education has frequently asked questions, and this slide deck will be provided to you. So you have the ability to go back in and click on the links. And so the Department of Education created a frequently asked question sheet. You can actually search that for different things. You can say, you know, can I buy transportation tools or field trips, or can I buy curriculum? Can I hire more teachers? You can actually search that within the document. So that's one place to start. And then the Department of Education also has these fact sheets, and some of them are fact sheets. They're tables and charts, and some are emails. So you can go through and check on construction. You know, I want to do this kind of construction. I want to put an HVAC system. So yes, I can buy an HVAC, but what about the asbestos that I find in the ceiling as I'm going about putting in the HVAC? Can I repair that? And oh, what about the roof that I discovered as I'm putting in the HVAC also was leaking? So those kinds of things you can actually search. And oftentimes you'll find in these documents the actual word. Sometimes you have to do synonym searches to find out what is allowable. Additionally, you'll notice that there are different kinds of, there's slide decks, there's a letter, there's a report. Those are all from different sources on construction, and they report out the same information, but in slightly different ways. So again, those are all just resources for you. Labor shortages have to do with the recruitment and retention of teachers. So you can look at that as a way to use your funds. And then lastly, I put this fact sheet here on the DUNS and the UEI. So those are numbers identified for educational entities, and you do need to have those in order to report on how you used funds. So if your district or your nonprofit doesn't have those, we do need to get those for this next year's data compliance reporting that we do. A couple of other tips that you want to use in terms of the background is to make sure you're using the most restrictive funds first. So those Esser 1 funds need to be expended by this year. You want to use those first and then go to 2 and 3. You also want to look at cost effectiveness. So when you're proposing to do something, you can look at, what is the most cost effective way to provide this? What are the greatest gains I can get, short and long term? And again, promoting that in an engaged process to your stakeholders is really important. Next slide. So looking at where to use ESSER funds, this is a way to document looking at that compliance and the impact. We at the state level are often asked, so how has the state addressed the issue of lead? How has the issue of at-risk students been addressed? And so we will go through and look at a state level as to how the funds could be used to impact those areas. And then we will look at, so how have we used them? You at the district level can do the same thing. So you can look at, these are the programs that we've provided to the community, and these were the resources we used. And this is why we were able to do this, because in the frequently asked questions, it has different pieces, social emotional learning that we can use. We created an art program and a sports program. We were looking at continually paying employees during COVID and looking at these different pockets and documenting it back to those frequently asked questions. That's all this document is, but sometimes this is something that the public wants to know, that your stakeholders may want to know. Next slide. So this whole issue comes up a lot about how do we spend the funds? How do we let the public know that we're not just putting in a fence, but we're putting in a whole playground or an outside space for learning? How can we help the public understand that there's a benefit in that? How can we use the ESSER funds for that construction? And you are generally looking at renovating something. You're looking at the allowable uses, but also you're taking an existing use of land or an existing use of a building and saying, how can we make it better? Whether that's ventilation, roofing and plumbing. There are a lot of different things that you may want to do to improve the health of students in your building. And that's definitely something that's allowable with ESSER funds. If the item goes above $5,000, whether it's the purchase of a item or a project, then it will need to go into this capital expenditure pre-approval process, which follows a lot of guide compliance items. And during the audit section of these sessions in the afternoon and the one this morning, Dan Moody did identify several that were in there. So there's lots of federal requirements on how do I get contractors, how many bids do I need to do? All those processes are in the capital expenditure form and pre-approval process. Next slide. So we're going to transition now into perspective and where are we now and going. And I'm going to have Rebecca identify those pieces for you. Again, feel free to put into the comment section any questions that you may have on this, and we will address those as we go through these slides.
All right, next slide, please. So you've seen this slide before today, but where we're sitting right now. So if you look at the thermometer chart that's over on the right side of this screen, this is what's on our website right now. And according to this chart, about 82% of ESSER 1 has been spent. Now, this data was pulled, you can see it was pulled back on June 15th. So ESSER 1 dollars have been spent since June 15th. And right now, I believe we're sitting at about 87% of ESSER 1. So we're getting closer to spending that down. But just as a reminder, ESSER 1 has to be spent by September 30th. So just do a quick check-in. Where is your district at right now? How many ESSER 1 dollars do you have left? We have kind of all over the board. We have schools who have $6 left in ESSER 1. We have schools who have $0 left, and then we have schools who have a little bit more. So please just make sure that you are checking in with your district and making sure that you have a plan to get that spent down by September 30th. And then remember that ESSER 2 needs to be spent down by September 30th of next year, 2023, and ESSER 3 needs to be spent by September 30th of 2024. Next slide, please. Now that ESSER has been around for a while, we're starting to get used to it. We're getting into these processes. We're getting a feel for how ESSER works. And now we really need to start focusing on where we're going, start publicizing all of the good that Esser has been able to accomplish. Already we've seen school districts do some amazing things with Esser, and that's so awesome. But if your community doesn't know about it, or your community doesn't really understand how your Esser dollars are being spent, they're not going to view it as successfully as you and I do. So you need to make sure that you are being public with those cool things that that Esser is enabling your school or your organization to do. Next slide, please. Esser has been enabled schools and organizations to implement highly effective and beneficial programs, which normally without these Esser dollars would be cost prohibitive. But since we had the opportunity with these Esser dollars to start these programs, now we're getting the question, the worry, what happens when Esser ends? What happens when the dollars stop? We don't want these programs to stop. These programs are awesome. We're seeing how they're benefiting our students. How do we keep them going? So we're kind of looking at the cliff that's coming up. I mean, you see this picture. We're standing right here going, oh no, there's a cliff edge coming up. How do I avoid this? How do I move on from this? Next slide, please. It is hard to think about. You think about you're standing at this cliff. How do you continue these programs after the funding stops? So we're here to help you through this process. Next slide. We are encouraging you to promote and to share your use of these Esser funds. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Involve your community. Make sure that your community knows what Esser is allowing you to do. Be public with Esser. Be public with the student gain from what is happening. As you're doing this, publish your plan. That is a requirement of the grant, but also take progress pictures. As you have contractors in your schools ripping up flooring, take pictures. If you have new technology that comes in, take pictures of people moving it around and using it. Make sure that you have a visual representation of what's happening. You can bring in the newspaper, the TV station, show them what's being achieved and let them report out for you. You can host events, you can do open houses, you can give tours, you can, I think Wendy said earlier, you can have a booth at the county fair. I mean, just make sure that you're connecting with your community and making sure that the public has a chance to come in and see for themselves your success with the Esser dollars. Next slide, please. If the community has a partnership, if they're seeing what you're doing and they understand why you're doing it, and they can come in and they can look and they can touch and they can hear what is happening, they're going to buy into your success. They are going to buy into what you're doing with these dollars. They'll be invested in this. They will care. And then when the federal funding ends, the community partnership will be there. The community will still like these programs and they will help you to continue. I'm born and raised in Montana. I come from a small town, and I know that in Montana, our communities are what makes us strong. We are really connected to our communities, and the community support is what helps these programs continue after the federal dollars stop. Next slide, please. Think backwards from the end to the beginning. So right now we're kind of sitting in the middle. Esser has been going on for a while. We're used to this grant, we're getting used to this terminology, and we can see the cliff that's coming up. So starting with thinking in the future, think backwards. Where I am right now, what do I need to be doing to get to a good spot by the time we reach this cliff where the funding ends? What data and photos are going to help us tell the story of how our school is using these funds? What can students, parents, teachers, the school, and the whole community gain through this data and these photos? Who can we engage? What can we all gain? And again, I want to emphasize this in red here. The community is going to support successful schools and programs, but they're not likely to support those that are perceived to be failing. If they just walk by and they see, oh, well, we put up a great big iron fence, and they don't see the benefit that that is bringing to your students and your community, they're less likely to support that. So down at the bottom here, we've got this table of just some suggestions of things that have been done. You could reach out to accountants in your community and see if they could help you with an audit check. without bringing in the OPI auditors. So maybe some of them could do like a volunteer or just help you out with that process. Like Wendy said earlier, you could reach out to your students. If you have NHS students or Key Club students, they could help gather and synthesize the data on how your ESSER dollars are being spent. Rotary and PEO members, retired teachers, people who are really invested in your school and your community. Hospitals and other businesses. I mean, these are all people who are in your communities who you may not have thought about at first with reaching out about ESSER dollars. But as we know, like everybody has something to bring to the table. Make sure that you are leaving them a seat at the table and inviting them in. Next slide, please. And again, please keep in mind these dollars, even though they may be spent on an HVAC system or new floors in the school, you gotta always tie it back to how is this benefiting our students? When we benefit our students, that benefits our community because our students are our community. Next, please. So some substance here. I've got a few slides on suggestions on what your publications could look like. Next slide. You could do something like an article in a newsletter or a newspaper. So I've got some examples here, everything from just a picture with a caption to a couple paragraphs to an entire full page spread with several pictures. This can be as simple or as thorough as you want it to, but again, you're giving that visual representation to your community and you're giving some details as well. They want to know the details. Next, please. You can also utilize social media. If you have, if your school has Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, you can utilize those social media pages to give some visual representation or also just get information out in the community. Specifically on Facebook, you can organize events and post an event on Facebook and get people to say, yeah, I'm coming to this event. So if you're doing like a groundbreaking ceremony for a new playground or something like that, those are ways that you can engage your community through social media. Next, please. And then after you've got the publication itself, then you want to think about, well, who needs to see this publication? So next slide, please. First, you could show this to your local newspaper or your regional newspaper. If you go to the next slide, I just went to the Wikipedia page for Montana newspapers, and these are the regional Montana newspapers. But I know, like small towns, I grew up in Conrad, Montana, and we had the Independent Observer. That was Conrad's newspaper. So you could do your local newspaper, you could do your regional newspaper, or both. Next, please. There's also TV news stations all over Montana. If you go to the next slide, I've got links to all those as well. You can reach out to your TV news station. You could send them pictures that they could show, or sometimes they'll even bring a camera crew in and tour your facility and show it visually that way. Next slide. And you could send them a blurb. They could read it on the radio, or you could bring them in, give them a tour, and then they could talk about it on the radio. They can say, I went into this school and they're doing such awesome things, and broadcast that out to the community. That is so good. That's good press. That's good publication for you. So keep those in mind. Next, please. Esser benefits our students, which benefits our community. You always got to keep the students in mind. They are the reason for all of this. And as you're thinking about your audience, everywhere people gather. So this might be the post office. It might be your local C-store. It might be a church in your community. Like anywhere people gather together, you want to visually represent the Esser student gains from your school. Use these Esser funds to make your community strong. And again, you know your community way better than anybody else. Who is in your community that I didn't necessarily mention on these slides? Reach out to your community, connect with your community, and let them help you make these Esser connections. Next slide, please. Again, we've got all of our resources at opi.mt.gov. If you go to that OPI homepage, there's a great big button that says Esser. You click on that and that'll take you to our Esser homepage. Next slide. And if you have any questions about Esser, you can always reach out to myself or Wendy. We've got our emails and phone numbers here.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that presentation. Really appreciate that. At this point, if there are any questions, I didn't see any in the comment session initially, but if you have any, you can choose the chat button and just enter in a couple of questions if you have them in there.
And if you have any questions on like how specifically to promote your school and your use of Esser funds, I was a shop teacher for 3 years. My dad was a shop teacher. And one of my favorite things of being in that arena was being able to show the community what my students were doing. So my students would be working in the shop and making these really cool projects. And every week I'd send something off to the newspaper or post something on the Facebook page so that our community could see what the students were doing and learning. So I do have a little bit of experience with this, and I would love to help you and your school be really public about how you're using these Esser funds.
Thank you. And that's our next session that we're going to move into is the Hall of Fame. We're going to take about a 10-minute break here. And as we move into the Hall of Fame, we're going to have 3 school districts share across what they have done with the Esser funds, both from the gains as well as some of the challenges and solutions that they found for those challenges. So please join us back here at 2 o'clock to hear from Great Falls, Superior, and Glendive on their use of Esser funds and what they plan to use them for going forward. Thank you so much.